environmental and sustainability issues. Today we are joined by Rafe Mair, a British Columbian who served as a cabinet minister, a broadcaster known for his sharp political commentary, as well as an environmental activist, a recognized author, and a columnist. Also with us is Damien Gillies, a documentarist and a speaker with a focus on environment, water issues, and salmon farming. My name is Irma Arkus. I'll be your host today, and you are watching EVOTV. Stay with us. Thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.
My pleasure.
It's really incredible having you both here because you've recently started a new venture, the Common Sense Canadian. Can you tell us a little bit about what prompted this particular news site with environmental issues on it?
Well, we got together, Damien and I got together over the Pitt River dispute about 3.5 years ago. A fellow named Tom Rankin ran an organization called the Save Our Rivers, and we both got involved in that, went right through the 2009 election. And when the election went to the Liberals, it was clear that no government in British Columbia was going to do anything to address these issues that we were dealing with. We thought we only have one option, and that's to get together ourselves and put something together. And there we are, the 31-year-old kid and the very ancient old man.
How are you dealing with creating content for Common Sense Canadian?
Well, we have a roster of great contributors who are experts in their various fields, and I think you raise an important point for us, which is that we don't want to be everything to everyone. We're very specific about why we started this. We feel that the lack of mainstream media attention on the kind of issues that we care about, water, energy, oil pipelines and super tankers, the salmon farms, food security in British Columbia particularly and in Western Canada, that's been a key reason why these things have been able to go on. And so we both being media people, myself a filmmaker, and Rafe with his background in radio and writing, we've also teamed up with a number of other people who are experts in those different areas, and they contribute their insight, writing articles for us, and we're able to bring those people all together and create a forum for that kind of discussion, and that's what we want to be.
These are not difficult issues, Irma. They're made to sound difficult by the government and by the corporate establishment, but they're not. They're capable of being described in very simple terms. And all we ask is that a person have a deep love of the environment. If they do that, we can help them understand the issues. And I think that's what we're driving to do, and I frankly think we're doing a pretty good job of it.
Let's go back a little bit. I want to ask you guys, because you've been discussing this particular topic for a while, how important is water for BC?
Wow. I think yeah. All the issues that we're talking about here really come back to water, whether it's pipelines and oil tankers, whether it's mines like the Fish Lake that would have destroyed
fracking.
Fracking is a perfect example. Not only, that actually is the key issue of this natural gas hydraulic fracturing, is the enormous volumes of water that they're actually, you've got companies up in, we're being told we need to build another dam to flood another piece of the Peace River. For energy, and we're being told that we need this. Meanwhile, we're allowing natural gas companies to take water out of the existing Williston Reservoir to use for fracking before it's gone through the dam and turned into electricity. So we're just robbing Peter to pay Paul here. And this, what that whole fracking business is taking that water and energy to create this natural gas to move it to the tar sands to further pollute watersheds across the border in Alberta. It's insane the way that we're abusing our water. And then all these private river power projects, we're talking about destroying our ecologies and our watersheds, and we have this notion that's being painted of these little Peloton wheels in the river or something undisturbed, and nothing could be further from the truth. And that's been my role, is to go around the province into these places in the wilderness and film these guys, even in spite of their best efforts to keep us out of these places, to show British Columbians what the construction, the transmission lines, the roads, all the destruction that has to happen in the name of quote-unquote green power.
There's an elephant in the room too, Irma, and it's called NAFTA. We haven't investigated thoroughly what this is going to mean. If once this starts with American companies, does it mean that they can do it forever and we have no jurisdiction over changing it? Now, I'm not saying that is the case. What I am saying, though, is this is something that the governments have not addressed and have not made public. And that, I guess, is the important point. This has all been done behind closed doors, the whole bit.
So on one hand, we're being told that we need to renew our infrastructure, that we need to build new dams, that we need to do all of these different things, when in reality we don't actually siphon off, as individuals at least, that much power. The industry, however, requires a lot of power, and there seems to be this link between British Columbian production of power with the demands for power across the border and demands for power in Alberta.
Well, and in China, frankly, I mean, what's happening here right now is that BC and Western Canada are being transformed into the new sort of fossil fuel armpit for the emerging economies of the world. And you know, the pipelines that we're talking about here, there's a big natural gas pipeline. They want to take that gas, in addition to sending some of it to the tar sands, they also want to send a bunch of it to Kitimat, turn it into liquid natural gas, and put it on big tankers and start accessing the Asian market there, which they haven't done up until now. And then there are 3 major oil pipeline proposals, all cutting across hundreds, if not thousands, of our watersheds in BC to take oil to the coast and for the most part ship that to China. So there's incredible demand from that emerging economy across the Pacific for these resources.
We're being hoodwinked by the government and by industry. People have to understand that these pipelines and the tankers coming down the coast are not a risk, they're a certainty. You cannot do this without any end to it, without putting some limitation of the time, without it becoming an absolute certainty. So when we allow these pipelines to go ahead, when we allow these tankers to come down the coast, it is only a matter of time before we have not one disaster, but lots of disasters. And we're being soothed over with, well, you know, you have to take risks in this life. These are not risks. These are certainties.
And if there's any doubt to that, I mean, just look at the record of this very company, Enbridge, that had 3 major oil spills. I mean, they had, between them and TransCanada Pipelines, over 2 years, according to the National Transportation Safety Board, I believe it is, 75 oil spills or pipeline leaks over in a 2-year period. 3 of those by Enbridge, this very company proposing this pipeline across BC to Kitimat. In the United States, and they've just had another one in the Canadian Arctic, and it just never seems to end.
The very important point here, Irma, we're not even making any money out of this. Now, if British Columbia were raking it in by the billions, one could understand allowing terrible things to happen. But the people that are making the money are out-of-province companies. Now, they talk about employment. The employment is there while the pipeline is being built or whatever it is. They are usually crews from elsewhere that work for these companies, so they're not even British Columbians. They leave behind a couple of custodians, a huge ongoing mess, and we don't make a nickel out of it. It just makes no sense.
There seems to be a huge question regarding what the actual benefit is to British Columbians and what the actual quantifiable loss would be to British Columbians. We are talking about potential disasters that would cost billions of dollars to clean up, that would ruin people's lives, that would, you know, detach communities that depend on these public resources and natural resources for livelihoods as well as sources of food.
People should look at the pictures of the Exxon Valdez, look at the pictures in the Gulf of Mexico, look at the birds and the animals and so on. That happens again, for sure. Don't think that that's just something in the past and the companies have now found a way not to let that happen. They have not. This is going to happen. It makes no sense economically, makes no sense environmentally, makes no sense culturally. I'm talking about First Nations, makes no sense morally. These things are all dead wrong.
So the question then is, who's going to actually benefit from all of this?
Well, you know, it'll be Alberta-based and really foreign-based oil companies that operate in Alberta that we allow to profit from this in a sort of on a level that no other country in the world does, that has the kind of oil resources that we do. And the company continues to vastly exaggerate, based on what we know from internal information, vastly exaggerate the amount of jobs that would come to British Columbia. We know that maybe 1/3 of them, and they would be the very bottom end, lowest paying, lowest skilled jobs, would actually go to British Columbians in these communities. And you're talking about a couple of years to build a pipeline, and then that's it. And then you compare that with, you know, people watching the hockey playoffs and the Olympics, and you hear about Supernatural BC, and we've got this big ad campaign that we're paying millions of dollars for to attract people from around the world to this place. We built this brand, and it's all based on our incredible wilderness and ecotourism. And we have 50,000 jobs in the wilderness tourism industry here, many of them on the coast where these places, and it's not just First Nations and conservation groups who are opposed to these things. It's the president of King Pacific Lodge, which is the number 4 rated lodge in the wilderness resort in the world, according to the top publication. And they're opposed to this too, because they see that their business that they've work to build a sustainable business on the coast that's the largest employer in the area cannot survive in that context. It's a choice between one or the other. And we're left to believe that what we're talking about, that there's this sort of false dichotomy of choosing between the economy and the environment. And we're pegged, anybody who raises concerns about something like this are pegged with being anti-everything. And there's nothing further from the truth. What we want to do is see smart economic development for the people and environment of British Columbia.
Let's lay to rest too, Irma, this notion of the trickle down, that the companies will all have their money go out into the public. First of all, the companies aren't here, so that if it trickles down anywhere, it sure as hell isn't going to be here. Secondly, J.K. Galbraith had a little phrase for that. He said the trickle-down theory is that if you feed a horse enough oats, a few will pop up the other end to feed the sparrows. And so but that whole thing is so discredited. And the reason I say that is because you're asking, who's going to benefit? And I can tell you, it isn't going to be the citizens of British Columbia.
When you actually look into it, it seems that who is going to benefit are shareholders of companies that have the major say and derive most of the profits that these companies make. So in essence, what we come with is a picture that paints a pretty sad image of the future of BC, in which we're going to allocate our public resources, we're going to give those away for usage to mining and resource-based, resource extracting companies. And instead, what we're going to derive is just a lot of losses on every single field, including one of our local environment.
Look at the fish farming issue. I mean, these are Norwegian companies. I've traveled to Norway twice over the last several years. I've been to the AGMs of the big companies there and the big trade shows. 92% of this industry is headquartered in Oslo. The economic benefits that they pretend to, what little that there are, there's several thousand jobs that are created directly from the industry here, but that comes at the expense of the commercial and recreational fishing industries and all the tourism business on the coast that's being impacted by the impact on our wild salmon and marine ecosystems from this business. And all those profits are leaving the country and they're going back to Norway. And the same thing is true with these private river power programs where Warren Buffett and General Electric and Ledcor and these sorts of companies where many of the shareholders are outside of this country are the people that are getting the sweetheart deals. And you and I are paying for that by having our power bills supposedly go up another 50% in the next couple of years.
There's another direct thing that people ought to know. BC Hydro over the years has declared a very handsome dividend to the provincial government, which goes to schools and education, hospitals, that sort of thing. BC Hydro cannot do that anymore. BC Hydro is losing money hand over fist. This last year, they bought $600 million worth of private power that they didn't need. Now, the contracts with these private companies, which they're forced to go into by the government, they now total over $55 billion that are going to come to pass in the next 20 or 30 years. And that's what, $2 or $3 billion a year, whatever it is, and growing. Every new one adds to it.
So on one hand, we have the bankruptcy of BC Hydro, because that seems to be the direction where the outfit is going. And that's
well, to be clear though, they don't actually go bankrupt because the kicker here is that they can go back to us and hike our power bills up to make the difference. But we have a strong independent economic opinion that based on the way their finances, having analyzed their own finances, having been in dialogue with the Auditor General of this province, a gentleman named Eric Anderson that we work very closely with, who's basically showing that if this were a private company existing in the marketplace, they would be headed for bankruptcy protection right now. The only thing that's going to save them, and Christy Clark is pretending like, she wants to protect families by keeping these rates down, and it's all about bad BC Hydro and their mismanagement, when it's her government that she was a part of at the start of this whole thing that forced BC Hydro into signing these contracts that banned them from building any new public projects for the province in the way that they've done so well for the last 40, 50 years. And now they pretend like they have no idea why we're going to have to see our power bills go through the roof, and it's completely their fault.
There's this other aspect to it, and that's a lot of greenwashing, of course. We are being told, or we have been at least by the government, is that they have enabled all these companies to develop alternative resources of energy, right, in BC. Which sounds really great. It sounds really dandy, but when you actually look closer at what that means, we uncover that means a lot of coal production and a lot of privatization of our own waterways. What did you find in your investigation of how alternative these energy sources are and what they mean in long term for British Columbians?
Don't eat that, Elmer. I'll tell you, no question about it. If something has green in front of it, you can be sure it's as black as the ace of spades. You can just be certain. And everything that you've talked about, Irma, is a snare and a delusion. We are going to have more coal produced. There's no question about that. Everything is geared to China and China's benefit, not ours. And again, even if the coal was bad, as everybody says, and we shouldn't do it, if somehow we were making a great big bunch of money in our own pockets, it would be one thing. But that's just not happening, and it's not going to happen.
I mean, we've even gone as far as this government was just caught deliberately excluding all the carbon emissions associated with the coal mining that's going gangbusters right now in the province, and they'd like to do more. There's a big battle we've been involved in on the island over the Raven coal mine in Fanny Bay. And there's another, expansion proposed on the North Island, and China can't get this coal fast enough. And yet, in order to meet their when they set these targets out a few years ago, about I think it was a 33% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, Gordon Campbell made all these big promises, and not only can they not come close to that, but they have to exclude all the coal numbers from those figures just to even come close to making that.
Which principle are they excluding these particular numbers?
Their own principles, as they always have, just whatever suits them.
I've been around a while, Irma, and I go back to the coalition government in the 1940s, which got into trouble because the Attorney General was allegedly selling liquor licenses, that sort of thing. This government here, and I'm using this word in the dictionary sense, not the legal sense, this government here is the most corrupt government that the province has ever had. As I say, that's not a legal term. I'm talking about it. Look it up in the dictionary. And this government is absolutely without soul. It couldn't care less about the environment, couldn't care less about the people. All it cares about is being somehow idealistically pure. They take their orders from the Fraser Institute, and there's just no question about it. They imply their principles, and those principles are anti-people principles.
So the implication is really that most of the things that are done currently are under the guise of environmental principles, are under the guise of creating alternative energy sources, are under the guise of improving our lives in the long term.
Newspeak.
When in reality, we're actually faced with something entirely different, which is ideologically based, that privatization is good, and privatization of public resources that we own as taxpayers, and that this is somehow all for the better. Is there absolutely any truth to this, and are we actually going to see any green jobs out of any of these moves?
Well, I'll just go back to the river issue, okay? The very first problem in all of this is that there's no coupling of bringing on a new private river power project, which has tremendous ecological impacts, which I mentioned before and documented, which they completely ignore. They don't take into account how many carbon emissions are being released when you cut down all this forest. One of these projects calls for 450 kilometers of 100-meter wide right-of-way of forest through the Sunshine Coast forests, 250 kilometers of heavy-duty industrial roads, and we're talking almost like highways through the bush here, 100 industrial bridges. This is the GE Butte Inlet project. It would be the biggest private hydro project in Canadian history. It'd be bigger than Site C Dam. And try calling that green and flying over these places where they are doing some of this development already nearby. That's not even a fraction of the size in Toba Inlet of what they'd like to do in the Butte Inlet. But as I come back to the big problem is that even if you could make an argument that this is somehow zero carbon emission power once you've done all this damage to get it going, you would have to then say, we're going to shut down a coal-fired plant in Alberta for every one of these that we bring online. But that's not happening. So all you're doing is adding more ecologically destructive power on top of the current fossil fuel system that we have. And unless you make that, a one-to-one relationship, there's no benefit. You're not encouraging people to conserve and put our focus where it really needs to be, which is using less power. That's not happening at all.
I think your viewers should remember why W.A.C. Bennett brought in BC Hydro. Why did he take over BC Electric and make this huge power company? He did so because he said power is something that BC should have control over. It should be something the government can use as incentives. We should be able to promise electricity into places that are going to put industry there. And the people of British Columbia and the industry of British Columbia should have the cheapest available power. We have our own power, and we can therefore compete better, and people can live better and not spend so much money. That was his notion. Same thing with BC Rail and going into the hinterland. Same thing with BC Ferries. That dream, that image is being shattered. Now, we paid an enormous environmental price to get there when you take a look at the Columbia River and the Peace and so on. However, we've done that. We did that 40 years ago and 30 years ago. Now it's there. Now we have this wonderful power company, and we're destroying it. I mean, it just does not make any economic sense.
The other interesting part of all of this is, of course, the building of the dams, the Site C dam that we were discussing. Washington, for example, is dismantling their older
California
dams.
too, the biggest in history. Yeah.
That seems to be the new notion. And in fact, many biologists have been relatively outspoken about the fact that one of the reasons of decline of fish and marine animals is, of course, the fact that over 90% of water in the world has been dammed. And it has an impact down the line on how the oceans behave and how the environment behaves. So it seems kind of counterintuitive, if you have environmental goals, to be building these sort of mass projects that in reality contribute nothing to the public. Because again, as I mentioned before, when you look through the numbers, the public consumes about 8% of what BC Hydro produces.
Yeah. Well, this segues into, this segues into an interesting point, Irma. If you were the governor, let's say, of Oregon, and your people came to you and said, we need more power, governor, so we're going to dam the Willamette River, you would say, why would we do that when they'll dam one in British Columbia for us? I mean, this is where it leads. Why should we worry about how we heat our swimming pools in Southern California? Our pals in BC will take care of that. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say on that, follow up on that note, the interesting thing is that when this whole program was first rolled out, we were told we had this major self-sufficiency problem, that we don't make enough power for our needs, which is absolute hogwash based on the numbers from Stats BC and BC Hydro's own numbers. We have more than enough power, and we have lots of options available to us, like the Columbia River Treaty, where we're entitled to that electricity, but we don't need it, so we take money instead. So there's absolutely no need for this power from a self-sufficiency perspective. And once that became clear, they moved on to the next story, which was, this is for export. And we're going to all of a sudden build this big market for green power to sell to California, except for California doesn't and has refused year after year, in spite of the calls from this BC Liberal government and the private power industry, to change their rules. They don't consider any hydro project over 30 megawatts to be green power.
And they don't pay their bills anyway.
Well, they had I think, a good reason not to pay their bills when Enron and we were involved in that. We're hijacking the people and treating them like we were acting like pirates, basically. And that's what the private power industry does. But the point being is, they've been asked this question. They've asked it to themselves. Is this hydropower we're talking about, is it green? And they answer no every time. And the reason that's important is because it's more expensive, this new power. And so they have a program that says they have to buy a certain amount of their power, 20% from green sources, and they are able to pay more for that. They'll pay a premium for it because they recognize that it's green and that's the right thing to do. But this power doesn't qualify. So now all of a sudden we're stuck with this energy, and we can't sell it like we were told that we could across the border as green power, because they're not buying it. And they understand that. They're the ones, like you say, that are already recognizing this and taking down hydro dams, because they realize that it's not a good ecological trade-off.
The public's got to understand, Irma, that this power, when it's exported by BC Hydro, is at a loss, at a 50% loss.
At least.
At least. And the same thing if they use their own power use their power instead of using their own power. It's the same thing. The whole thing makes no economic sense, and we're often accused as environmentalists of just being woolly-headed. We've got to do things, etc. Well, there are lots of things that you have to do, and in a better world you wouldn't. We wouldn't pipe any natural gas down into Vancouver. However, that's been done for a long time. It has to be done. We rely upon it, and generally speaking, it's pretty good. And the consequences, this is the important point, the consequences of something happening to a natural gas pipeline are nothing like they are when an oil pipeline goes through, or that kind of thing. So we're not against all kinds of development. Some of it we wish we didn't have to do, but we know you have to sort of bite your tongue and do it. But the stuff we're talking about here today is absolutely unnecessary. BC Hydro, which constantly overstates the case for the power they need constantly. Way back to when I was in government back in the 70s, they did that.
And they were off by 33% over the last 10 years.
And
need
and
today.
they will tell you that for the next 20 years, we can get by just fine with the downstream benefits of the Columbia River project by upgrading our facilities, by adding facilities to flood control dams, by conservation by people, easily look after the next 20 years. And so that's what people must understand when they're looking at what the government is trying to do.